about the state. One of my most interesting conversations I had in this regard, what do we think about public services as anarchists? I went to Sweden, and I met a bunch of Swedish anarchists. And I thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. Okay. Most benevolent state you could possibly think of. What do Swedish anarchists have to say? And actually what they said was really interesting. What they said was, there's almost no institution that we identify with the Swedish welfare state that was actually created by the state itself. In just about every case, these institutions were created by community groups, by labor groups, by voluntary association, mostly around the turn of the century, the 20s and 30s. So even the public library system in Sweden was originally created by workers' cooperatives. What basically happened was the state stepped in at a certain point and they said, all right, you can have these things, we will maintain them, we will even spread them and make them stronger, but only on one condition: you guys don't run them anymore. And of course, once the state takes it over, that means at any moment they can take it away. So that was one really interesting thing. So the state hasn't actually created these institutions, they're basically all been co-opted. The second thing, however, is that they have this phrase, the social peace. And anarchists are constantly accused of violating the social peace. And underneath that concept, he said, there's a really interesting implication, which they will actually say explicitly every now and then in unguarded moments, which is it's assumed that the basic relation between the state and its people is that of war. The government, in a way it goes back to Proudhon's famous remark about anarchy and order. Some people say this is the actual meaning of the circle A, that the circle is actually an O, and it stands for order. So Proudhon's famous quote was, anarchy is order, government is civil war. On some level, states seem to recognize that they are institutionalized civil wars of themselves against something called the people, which is permanently in abeyance. There is a truce in this civil war, and the terms of the truce are the welfare state. But deep beneath that, there is war. That is the fundamental reality. And if you bring that up, if you go back to that, if you break the truce, we all know what's going to happen. Now, this got me to thinking. These abstract functions of the state, if you want to use Spivak's language, these various components of the state, do they go back to the same origins? Do they necessarily belong together? So, for example, administration, bureaucracy, even we think of as a basic nature of the state, and we assume that's related to the violent aspects of the state, because the state operates particularly through a bureaucracy of violence, armies, police. But in fact, they have different origins. Historically, in fact, one of the fascinating things for me historically is that you can find any combination of those elements that have come together in the modern state separately, without each other in world history. So it's perfectly easy to find kings, for example, with sovereign power, sovereignty originally just meaning the power of kings, without a state. Kings don't have a monopoly of the legitimate use of force. Nobody imagines that they could or should. But you have all this royal ritual and retainers and fanfare, but no government. In fact, you often find kings with no administration at all. Other ones that do. So bureaucracy, you have situations where there's forms of bureaucracy that exist outside of states. You also find, another really fascinating one to me is the elections, electoral systems. If you look at the history, nobody ever talks about the history of electoral systems because it's an embarrassment to our basic assumption of how government works. We talk about democracy as if elections are the essence of democracy. And there's a whole series of conceptual moves that were done around the 18th century when all these things, which are sort of patched together, came together. And one of them is the notion of representative democracy, which is related to popular sovereignty. That the people should have a power once reserved for states. Now, I don't know if people know about how many people have heard of the concept of the paradox of sovereignty? Okay, one. This is a really interesting idea, actually. It blew me away when I first heard it. So the basic idea is like once kings had this arbitrary power of life and death over their subjects. That's what sovereignty actually means. Nowadays, it is the people who are sovereign. That's the and over time, this idea came to be attached to democracy. That's what democracy was. Now, there's a basic problem. So, like in theory, the police, the government, it's a monopoly of coercive force. They're the only people who have the legitimate right to use violence. Why is it legitimate for them to use violence? Because they are enforcing the law, right? Where does the law come from? The law comes from the Constitution. Okay, where does the Constitution come from? The legitimacy of the Constitution. The legitimacy of the Constitution comes from the people. That's popular sovereignty, right? How did the people actually establish the legitimacy of the Constitution? Through violent revolution. So, in other words, the legitimacy of the code of laws which allows the police to use force comes from acts of illegal violence, which is what revolution is. Because after all, I mean, the people who created modern constitutions, the American French Revolution, all committed treason according to the laws under which they were brought up. Violent treason, the uprising. So this creates a basic problem. If sovereign power is ultimately, the legitimacy comes from the right of the people to revolt, well, how do you tell the difference between the people and a rampaging mob? When do you have to do what they say, and when is it okay to kill them? Nobody's actually ever been able to solve this problem legally. The basic answer seems to be in retrospect. If they win, that was the people. All right, so there's a basic problem in the very idea of sovereignty. All right, but let's get back to democracy. Now, it's important to remember, and whenever I like to annoy liberals, or actually most Americans, I always point out to them that nowhere in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution does it say anything about America being a democracy. Those guys hated democracy. They were explicitly against it. They thought democracy meant what we do: popular rule, general assemblies, councils, Athenian-style direct democracy and deliberation. They thought, explicitly said, this is the worst form of government. It's mob rule. It'll lead to the kind of argument was it'll lead to oppression of minorities. The particular minority they had in mind being the rich. And John Adams is really explicit. He said, how could we have majority rule? That's ridiculous. We have 1 million people with property, 9 million people with no property. First thing that happens is they'll abolish the debts. The second thing, they'll redistribute the land. But they got this ingenious idea that, well, we have to have popular sovereignty. How will we do that? Elections. Elections will be the way that the people sort of express their sovereignty, the power of kings. Now, and they took this old English habit of elections. But this is the interesting thing. There had been elections going on in England at least back to the 1100s. Many parliamentary people were elected. It never occurred to anybody in England or other countries where they practiced elections that elections had anything to do with democracy. In fact, if you look at history, democracy, at least in the Western tradition, elections have always been assumed to be the aristocratic mode of selecting leaders, because the aristocracy means the best. A small group of elite people decide, allow their followers to decide which of them is the best of all. And it goes back to Homer. I mean, even a lot of those guys, sort of heroic aristocrats are often selected by their followers by acclaim or other means. Greek democracy is warrior democracy as well. Greek elections were held, in oligarchic states and not in democratic states, which ran by popular assemblies. You know what the actual democratic mode of selecting people to fulfill magistrates or other positions was? Anybody know this? What's that? Dice, lottery, yeah. Athens used this widely. Florence, other democratic states in the Middle Ages. You know, what they did was everybody, you know, you could take a test for basic literacy and competence, and then they just, if you want to do it, it's like jury duty, except it's voluntary. They put your name in the hat and select people. All right. They decided not to go through lottery and to create this sort of what they called an aristocracy of achieved aristocracy, an aristocracy not of birth, but of knowledge and competence, which would run America. But it was not assumed to be a democratic thing. In fact, their model was Rome, the Roman Republic. That's why we have a Senate. And essentially the mechanisms of government were set up to suppress the dangers of democracy, as they called it, just have a limited democratic element for